Welcome to the 18th year of the Honors Senior Thesis Defenses. Thank you for taking the time out to be part of this celebration of 9 months of hard work. I want to take a few minutes to acknowledge the following individuals and groups that helped to make this process possible. First, the administration and faculty at Pulaski Academy for supporting the thesis projects over the past 2 decades. This year, over 30 faculty members and administrators are serving on committees. Secondly, I want to thank Sarah Gorman, been instrumental in helping with the promotion of the thesis projects this year, and the technical assistance has been invaluable. Finally, I want to thank Matthew Thornton's committee members, Ms. Carrie South and Ms. Katie Parson, for helping out through 9 months of long, hard research and editing and encouragement, and he could not have finished the project without their assistance. At this time, I'm going to turn it over to Matthew Thornton on pot policy in the United States. Thank you.
Yes, I would also like to say thank you to my committee members. Thank you. Okay. Hello, everyone. Thank you all for coming. My name is Matthew Thornton, and my thesis is titled Pot Policy, the Failure of the Federal Prohibition of Cannabis and the Growing Call for Legalization. The purpose of this project was to illustrate the failure of the United States government's war on drugs and to provide reasoning and understanding for supporting the legalization movement. Before I start, I'm going to do a literature review. Marijuana, A Short History by John Hudak was one of my most valuable sources. It provided a fantastic overview of the entirety of cannabis prohibition from historical, cultural, and scientific side, and it really helped me find a starting point for my research. Drug Policy Alliance is an organization dedicated to fighting against the war on drugs, and they had a lot of information on not only the history of cannabis prohibition, but also the current movement for legalization. I conducted 3 interviews. Itai Bitan, who is the CEO of Marigold Labs in Little Rock, helped me gain an understanding of the scientific side of cannabis and of the business side. North Little Rock police officer Matthew Thomas helped give me a police perspective on the legalization debate, as well as look into the Little Rock Police Department's cannabis policy. Little Rock Normal let me attend one of their first meetings, and they gave me copies of the laws they wrote and answered many of my questions on legalization and prohibition in Arkansas specifically. Marijuana is the flower of the cannabis plant, which contains the psychoactive resin and other cannabinoids, and it is the part of the plant that this thesis will focus on. Due to the racist connotations associated with the word marijuana, which I will discuss shortly, I will refer to it just as cannabis. The history of the federal prohibition of cannabis. After the Mexican-American War and Mexican Revolution in 1910, there was a large and growing Mexican-American population in the American Southwest, and there was a growing feeling of xenophobia towards them from white Americans. Cannabis use was popular among many Mexican agricultural workers, and white Americans began using it as a target for their xenophobia, and they became afraid that the Mexicans were going to give their killer weed to white children. As xenophobia increased, states and localities began passing laws prohibiting cannabis, beginning with California in 1913. In 1930, Congress passed the Porter Narcotic Bill, which created the Bureau of Narcotics, and President Herbert Hoover named Harry Anslinger commissioner of the Bureau. Anslinger saw the growing xenophobia towards Mexican immigrants being channeled towards cannabis, and he decided to capitalize off of it. On July 5th, 1927, the New York Times published an article about a Mexican family that went insane after eating herbs from their garden, which authorities found had cannabis growing in it. This gave Anslinger all the proof he felt he needed, and he began claiming that cannabis caused the family to go insane and began warning parents about the drug doing the same to their children. Anslinger's platform was largely based on fear-mongering. He instilled a fear in parents that their children would become, quote, slaves to this new narcotic, continuing addiction until they deteriorate mentally, become insane, and turn to violent crime and murder, an addiction which he dubbed reefer madness. The most significant result of Anslinger's war on cannabis was the 1937 Marijuana Tax Act, which created a tax registry on cannabis products, which forced people to disclose whether or not they bought or sold cannabis. The word marijuana did not exist prior to the 20th century, and it was gradually adopted by states and localities prohibiting cannabis since it sounded more Hispanic than just cannabis. In addition, much of Anslinger's prohibition campaign revolved around the use of dog whistle politics, such as consistent claims about Mexican Americans using cannabis to corrupt white youth. Sometimes Anslinger didn't even try and hide his racism. He believed and vocalized consistently that the most frightening effect of cannabis was that it, quote, made Negroes forget the appropriate racial barriers and unleash their lust for white women. He made lots of comments about cannabis use causing interracial sexual encounters. By the 1960s, attitudes towards cannabis began to change, and by the end of that decade, it was met with a hard pushback from the federal government. Richard Nixon fought against drugs in a very similar way to Anslinger. Nixon roused the silent majority of the religious right against drug use in the country by saying that it was a symbol of cultural permissiveness and that it was the reason for the rise in crime rates in the country. While Nixon seemed like the law and order candidate in 1968, we know now that he was a man riddled with fear of anyone unlike himself, and this was reflected through his drug policy. Nixon's bigotry was the main reason for the Nixon administration's drug policy, as confirmed by Nixon aide John Ehrlichman in 2016 with the following quote. I won't read it, but it basically says that the Nixon administration had two main enemies, which were the anti-war left and African Americans. And by criminalizing the drugs that those communities were associated with, they could break up those communities and their movements. The event that set Nixon's drug war in motion was a Supreme Court case, Leary v. United States in 1969, which held that the Marijuana Tax Act was unconstitutional because it violated the Fifth Amendment by forcing someone to disclose whether or not they committed one crime or else be charged with another crime. In response to the decision, Nixon worked with Congress in order to pass the Controlled Substances Act of 1970. The Controlled Substances Act formalized drug scheduling, dividing prohibited substances into 5 schedules based on, quote, the drug's acceptable medical use and the drug's abuse or dependence potential, although the FDA and Surgeon General have no say in scheduling at all, and cannabis was classified as a Schedule I narcotic along with heroin. In 1971, Richard Nixon officially declared the United States government's war on drugs, and Congress provided the funding and support for the drug war throughout March of 1973 when they voted to pass Reorganization Plan 2, which pulled all of the relatively scattered drug enforcement bureaus into one, the Drug Enforcement Agency. Carter attempted to convince Congress to decriminalize cannabis at the federal level during his administration, but that ultimately failed, although he did provide an example that encouraged 5 states to decriminalize personal possession of cannabis. But the movement for decriminalization quickly died in 1980 when Ronald Reagan entered office. Reagan ran on an explicitly tough-on-crime platform, and the effects of his policies and rhetoric are still reverberating today. The Reagan administration is remembered in drug policy for her passing several broad-scope anti-drug laws, namely the Anti-Drug Abuse Acts of 1986 and 88, which both drastically increased mandatory minimums for drug-related sentences across the board. Federal spending on drug control rose from $1.5 billion in 1981 to roughly $6.6 billion as Reagan was leaving office in 1989. The Reagan administration also pushed for heavy cultural change around drugs, especially targeting American youth. Nancy Reagan's infamous Just Say No campaign tried to steer high schoolers away from trying drugs, and the White House partnered with Partnership for a Drug-Free America to release dozens of drug-related PSAs from the mid-1980s until the early 2000s, focused on scaring kids out of trying drugs. President Bush carried on the drug war of his predecessor without making much change, although Bush did create the Office of National Drug Control Policy, or ONDCP, in 1989, which led much of the federal drug war from there on out. By 1992, drug use had plummeted in the United States, as did the importance of the war on drugs. Bill Clinton illustrated this by being the first elected official to admit using cannabis. After he was elected, he was highly criticized for his admission, as well as for his relaxed attitudes towards cannabis, since Clinton initially believed that the harsh criminalization of cannabis was ineffective and that it, quote, confused being tough with being smart. Between 1993 and 1997, cannabis use, as well as the use of prescription drugs and party drugs like ecstasy, nearly doubled, and Clinton began to face the same problem as Jimmy Carter did. I didn't mention that. He wanted to relax drug laws, but there was a rise in drug use, and politicians, law enforcement, and parents alike were all calling for a crackdown. Eventually, Clinton broke from the political pressure and worked with Congress to pass the Violent Crime Control and Law Enforcement Act of 1994, commonly known as the 94 Crime Bill. The crime bill had some provisions focused on rehabilitation and youth prevention, but it mostly focused on harsh criminalization. During the Clinton administration, the number of inmates in federal prisons for drug offenses nearly doubled, and cannabis arrests reached their highest point in any number before or after Clinton. Despite this, the legalization movement, which had been around but small and basically irrelevant since the 1970s, found its first big victory. In the late 1980s and early 1990s, Dennis Peron worked to mobilize AIDS patients, doctors, and advocates in communities ravaged by the AIDS epidemic of the late 1980s to allow patients to use cannabis medically to help alleviate their symptoms. This materialized into California's Compassionate Use Act of 1996, which made California the first state to legalize cannabis for medical purposes, putting the state at odds with the entire nation. The Clinton administration tried and failed to crack down on medical cannabis, but the Bush administration still decided to wage a war on medical marijuana under direction from Bush's Attorney General, John Ashcroft. Their war failed pathetically, as the number of federal raids on cannabis clubs grew and the nation watched as federal agents arrested terminally ill patients in pajamas and wheelchairs. The support for medical legalization grew. By the end of the decade, another 8 states had legalized cannabis medically, and at the end of the Bush administration in 2008, voters in Massachusetts voted yes on question 2, making it the first state to decriminalize possession of cannabis since the 1970s. While campaigning for presidency, then Senator Barack Obama was asked a question about his former drug usage, which he openly discussed in his 1995 memoir, Dreams of My Father. Obama replied that he, quote, inhaled frequently and voiced an opinion that, whether people liked it or not, cannabis use was a part of growing up. Obama had no strong stance on cannabis legalization, instead promising to leave it up to states and to not interfere. But his promise to not interfere in state legalization was tested in 2012 when both Colorado and Washington state legalized cannabis recreationally. In 2013, after threats of a constitutional shutdown and to cut Colorado off of federal funding, the Department of Justice released an official statement saying that it would not interfere with legalization measures, whether medical or recreational. Colorado and Washington set a baseline for a groundbreaking policy experiment, and it was successful. As of 2020, 11 states have legalized cannabis recreationally, with more working to put it on the ballot in November, and the first bill proposing to legalize cannabis at the federal level, the Marijuana Opportunity, Reinvestment, and Expungement, or MORE Act of 2019, has passed committee and is the closest any law has come to legalizing cannabis at the federal level. Medicinal cannabis. Before discussing the uses of medical cannabis, we first need to understand how it works with the human body. In the human anatomy, we have a system of receptors and glands known as the endocannabinoid system, shortened to ECS, that interact with the chemicals from cannabis, which are called cannabinoids. The main cannabinoids that are important to the mainstream discussion of cannabis are delta-9 tetrahydrocannabinol, or THC, and cannabidiol, or CBD. At its most basic definition, THC is the psychoactive component of cannabis, whereas CBD is the therapeutic component that cannabis research has been focused on in recent years. This is oversimplified since both are therapeutic in their own ways and work together along with a vast array of other cannabinoids to cause the effects of ingesting cannabis. CBD's interaction with the ECS blocks peripheral pain sensory neurons and acts as an anti-inflammatory pain medication, which can be used to treat both chronic and mild pain conditions. Some people use it to treat headaches or chronic migraines, and some women use it to help alleviate painful symptoms of menstruation. Along with this, some patients prefer to use CBD instead of prescription opioid painkillers after surgery. CBD not only has similar pain-reducing properties as opioids, but it is also better for the body and does not cause some of the painful or discomforting side effects of opioids, such as constipation and withdrawal symptoms after use. While THC does cause anxiety and paranoia, CBD actively works to counteract those effects. CBD directly activates serotonin receptors, which is why many use it to treat anxiety, and many veterans use it to cope with PTSD. One of the most praised benefits of CBD is for its anticonvulsant properties. An example of this is with Dravet syndrome, an intractable form of childhood epilepsy that begins within the first year of life and is almost impossible to treat with common anticonvulsants. Since common anticonvulsants provided no relief, the parents of a young girl with the syndrome switched her to a high CBD concentrate oil, and the patient eventually dropped from 300 seizures a day to a few a month and was able to resume normal development, which was stunted by the disease. While most of the medical uses for cannabis focus on CBD, THC is effective in reducing nausea and stimulating appetite. This is especially useful amongst cancer and HIV/AIDS patients undergoing treatment for those diseases, since debilitating nausea is associated with both of their treatments. Pharmaceutical companies have tried to replicate the beneficial effects through synthetic THC pills such as Drobenol, but patients and doctors agree that it is ineffective since it only contains the synthetic THC and none of the other therapeutic cannabinoids such as CBD. A possible but under-researched use for cannabis is as a treatment for addiction, specifically opioid addiction. Several symptoms of opioid withdrawal can be treated with medical cannabis, such as muscle aches and pains, nausea, and anxiety and depression. As the U.S. is in the midst of an opioid epidemic, finding an effective treatment option to help addicts recover is one of the most important steps the country can take in combating it. While it is incredibly useful for certain patients, it also has some dangers. While it is objectively safe to use cannabis as an adult, there are some dangers post-adolescence. While there is a lack of conclusive studies about the specific effects, it is generally known and accepted that cannabis use as an adolescent can hinder the development of the frontal lobe. Cannabis addiction is possible, although it should not necessarily be labeled as an addiction. When cannabis is used for a prolonged period of time, especially if it was during adolescence, the user can become psychologically dependent on the drug without the physiological effects of addiction. There's little to no physical pain associated with cannabis withdrawal, although some do report headaches, irritability, and vivid, strange dreams. The lack of physical dependency is why many are hesitant to label it as an addiction. Cannabis dependency will not result in the shakes associated with alcohol withdrawal or crippling physical pain associated with opioid withdrawal, but cannabis withdrawal can make you feel irritated and bored with life if you're not stoned. It is a very subtle addiction. The economic effect of legalization. The cannabis industry is split into two main parts, cultivation and sales. Acquiring a cultivation license in the United States involves one of the most competitive application processes, and some companies pay hundreds of thousands, if not millions of dollars in order to get one of the coveted licenses. Although some larger companies may be able to pay that price and hold on to the license long enough to make a profit, it is incredibly unrealistic to expect this trend to be sustainable, especially with the amount of small-time growers that want to enter the industry. Prices of cannabis are almost entirely determined by what cultivators sell it for. Therefore, cultivation ultimately determines how well the cannabis market does once the product goes to dispensaries. The cost of opening a dispensary, just like opening a cultivation facility, are too high for most people, therefore preventing the growth of the industry. Opening a dispensary can cost anywhere from $250,000 to upwards of $750,000, depending on the state. The biggest problem dispensaries face once open is that black market weed will always be cheaper than legal weed. For example, an eighth, or 3.5 grams, can cost anywhere from $30 to $50 on the black market, but from a medical dispensary in Arkansas, after the 4% privilege tax in addition to the state's regular 6.5% tax, it can cost around $60. Dispensaries would be more able to compete with the black market if it was not for the problems that the government, both federal and state, create for cannabis businesses, which will be discussed shortly. In addition, dispensaries struggle to get loans to start businesses and get business insurance once started, since large banks don't want to touch a federally illegal substance. Also, cannabis businesses are only allowed to have cash transactions. The black market for cannabis is massive, so when legalization was first proposed in Colorado and Washington in 2012, one of the main selling points for it is that it would take power away from the black market. While this isn't exactly how it went, which I'll discuss shortly, it did have positive effects. In Colorado specifically, legalization provided extra revenue for cities that were struggling to recover from the Great Recession of 2008. In addition, Amendment 64 contained a provision requiring the first $40 million in tax profit from cannabis sales annually to go towards public school construction and funding, boosting the Colorado public school system. Since the creation of the cannabis industry in Colorado, thousands of new jobs have been created, and law enforcement is able to save time and money by not focusing on small drug crime, instead being able to reallocate those funds to community outreach programs. The cannabis industry in Colorado has been steadily growing and expanding. In 2018, it earned approximately $1.5 billion. While legalization has been positive overall, Colorado Governor John Hickenlooper has said that it, quote, hasn't been the economic sensation people thought it was going to be. There are certain areas that have seen an increased need of funding, specifically in law enforcement, where they now have increased levels of stone driving and have to train officers to tell the difference between legal and illicit weed, but it can be argued that the benefits outweigh these costs. Legalization seemed like it would be a way to weaken the black market, but it has strengthened it in several states. According to Denver Attorney General Jason Dunn, Colorado has become, quote, the epicenter of black market marijuana in the United States. This is not necessarily the case inside the state, where the main black market customers are teenagers, but Colorado growers sending products to other states where cannabis is illegal, particularly in the Bible Belt and Midwest. Most of the struggles of the cannabis industry are caused by overtaxation and overregulation. For example, California has one of the largest legal cannabis industries, larger than Colorado's and Canada's combined. However, much of California's cannabis industry is still in the black market. Cannabis sales in California earned approximately $12 billion in 2019, with an estimated $8.7 billion coming from the black market. This is because the state has such strict regulations on the cannabis industry. Growers and dispensaries have to raise their price in order to afford to meet the regulations. California is not the only state whose cannabis industry has problems due to state regulations. In Oregon, the state's black market has been significantly weakened since there are not very scrutinous regulations. However, the cannabis market has become somewhat glutted since prices are so low, leading many Oregon growers to send products to states where cannabis is illegal in order to secure a profit. These two states show that the cannabis industry needs to meet kind of a Goldilocks standard. Too much regulation, as seen in California, will strengthen the black market in the state, but too little regulation, as seen in Oregon, will strengthen the interstate black market. The cannabis industry has to be both affordable and profitable to be successful, and when states like California go mad with the power to tax, they can end up overtaxing the industry to death. While more regulation could help combat the interstate black market in states like Oregon, the only sure way to weaken it is a national unity on cannabis laws. Pot politics. Due to the vast medical possibilities of cannabis, Big Pharma wants to lobby against cannabis legalization until they can form a monopoly over cannabis. Incest Therapeutics, for example, donated $500,000 to the group opposing the legalization initiative in Arizona in 2016, but in 2017 received DEA approval for Syndros, a synthetic THC formula which they will sell to patients that would benefit most from medical cannabis. Big Pharma has profited off of the ongoing opioid epidemic, which cannabis has the potential to solve, so it makes sense that they would also try and prevent legalization. Due to the drastic increases in asset forfeiture in the 1980s and 1990s, law enforcement has a financial stake in keeping cannabis illegal. Between 2002 and 2012, law enforcement in California earned approximately $181.4 million from cannabis-related forfeitures alone. Of all the groups that have a stake in cannabis prohibition, private prisons arguably have the largest since they directly profit off of drug arrests. They have inmate quotas to fill, and an easy way to reach them is through low-level drug crime. In 2016, 643,121 people were arrested for cannabis violations. It is important for private prisons to have prisoners, so they want to keep laws that bring in a significant number of prisoners. The most important part of legalization are the grassroots movements that manifest into laws. Behind every law legalizing cannabis is a grassroots movement fighting for it, many of which have larger cannabis lobbying groups behind them. When it comes to cannabis specifically, the National Organization to Reform Marijuana Laws, or NORML, is one of the main groups working for cannabis legalization. They donate money to politicians that support legalization and support local chapters working to get legalization on the ballot in their states. Drug Policy Alliance is largely focused on correcting the misinformation about cannabis and other drugs, and also working towards informing the public on the damage that the drug war has done to our society. They are working with New Mexico to get legalization on the ballot in November, and they were working in New York State before Governor Andrew Cuomo said that legalization would probably not receive any attention due to the ongoing COVID-19 pandemic. The National Cannabis Industry Association, or NCIA, defines themselves as, quote, leading the charge to protect the legal cannabis industry, defend our state laws, and advance federal policy reforms to end prohibition and expand opportunities within the legal cannabis industry. Unlike the previous two groups, the NCIA is more focused on the business side of the cannabis debate, focusing on issues such as differentiating hemp from the cannabis drug, which they succeeded in getting onto the 2018 Farm Bill. Future policy. The most important thing that can be done for cannabis is to remove it from the Controlled Substances Act. No proper industry can form to its full potential if the backbone of the industry is federally illegal. The MORE Act is the closest any law has come to federally legalizing cannabis. However, it is only passed committee and faces many more obstacles before it can become law. While former presidential candidate Bernie Sanders promised to sign an executive order ordering the Attorney General to begin the process for removing cannabis from the Controlled Substances Act, presumptive nominee Joe Biden has a different idea, which is to move cannabis from a Schedule I narcotic to a Schedule II. While this seems logical and like it would work, Schedule II is for strictly controlled medical substances only and not a recreational drug. Biden's approach would destroy the small business structure of the cannabis industry and likely make it another appendage of Big Pharma, appropriately dubbed Big Weed, since small businesses are unable to compete with the FDA's strict regulations. Cannabis does not need to be rescheduled, it needs to be descheduled. Before any other steps can be taken, it has to be legalized federally. One of the most praised provisions of the MORE Act is that it would reinvest cannabis earnings into communities most adversely affected by the war on drugs. Even today, in legal states, legal weed is disproportionately white, and people of color struggle more to open cannabis businesses than white people. To put it bluntly, white men in suits are getting rich off of what black and brown men have been getting disproportionately arrested for decades. As Wanda James, the first African-American woman to open a dispensary, said, quote, small businesses, women, and people of color who are disproportionately hurt by harsh marijuana laws are now getting left on the sidelines. One of the main points to ending the prohibition of cannabis is to work to undo a century of systemic racism, not to perpetuate it. Creating proactive drug policy in the United States will take years of cultural and legal changes to a broken criminal justice system. The first way to reaching this policy is federal cannabis legalization. We will never be able to arrest our way out of the drug problem. It's time to begin to change our approach to one that is more humane, that will help addicts and users rather than hurt them. Thank you.
All right. Tell me about, we had a couple interviews with the former student at PA, Itai, and we went to the normal meeting. Where did we miss some opportunities? What would you, if we're back, it's August 15th, we're starting the year over, what types of interviews could have made this project more rich and what could you have benefited from in the interview process, do you think?
I only did one interview with Itai and only went to one Little Rock Normal meeting, and I still wish I would have gone to more of those. I wish I would have gone back to Itai when I was writing my third chapter on medicinal cannabis, when I had a better understanding of it. And I wish I went to the Little Rock Normal meetings more consistently to keep getting information from them. Other than that, I'm still not really sure. I definitely think I could have conducted more interviews, but I'm not sure where to go with those.
Yeah, a lot of it would have been some of the businesses that are springing up. Obviously, would have been that would have been rich. Maybe even getting.
I did mean to go to one of those.
Yeah, the legal, even going to in the realm of well, you hit law enforcement with one interview, but even going into the justice system to see how they're dealing with this, I think would have been really beneficial. Even though I know you did not enjoy the economics part of this, it was so crucial, and you actually did a very good job with the economics. You don't give yourself enough credit for that. We've had a lot of papers over the years on drug issues, and what would you recommend to someone when they're tackling a public policy issue like drugs, as far as approaching the topic? Any suggestions you would give on that regard? In that regard?
On a larger scale above cannabis, the war on drugs is undoubtedly a failure. While there are people that will still attempt to justify it, there are no justifications for the traumatic societal impacts that it has, especially when you talk about how it disproportionately affects people of color. One example that I didn't mention in my defense, but I think that it is the most effective policy we could take, is through a harm reduction approach like Portugal, where rather than criminalizing drugs, we decriminalize personal possession, and instead of thinking about whether the drug itself is unhealthy, talk about whether or not the relationship with the drug is unhealthy. Because there are drugs that people use and they maintain it fine. Alcohol is a drug. How many people drink alcohol and aren't alcoholics? It's the same with all of it. While there are drugs that are more addictive than others, like heroin and crack, by decriminalizing them, we can treat the addicts rather than put them in prisons, give them no rehabilitation, and then put them back out on the streets where they're most likely going to pick up their habit again.
I'm going to turn it over to Ms. South or Ms. Either one wants to jump in here. Go ahead, Carrie.
I've got a few questions. So you talked about Anslinger's racial rhetoric being like the beginning of these policies in America against it. Why do you think his rhetoric is still so hardwired into our society today? Because people still reference things that came up that many years ago.
Well, first and foremost, everyone still calls it marijuana. But I don't know if some of his rhetoric specifically is still used, since when we look back on it, it's crazy. Like, the idea of reefer madness is laughable today. Like, we know that smoking a joint isn't going to make you go insane and shoot your girlfriend, which is part of the Reefer Madness movie that he worked to release in 1936. But it set a foundation for it. Like with the opium prohibition in the early 1800s being specifically targeted at Chinese immigrants, his prohibition was specifically targeted at brown men. It started with Mexican immigrants in the early 1930s, and later in the 1930s, it became targeted at the jazz scene, which was mostly African American. So while his specific rhetoric is not necessarily used today, the baseline that he set is still relevant in prohibition.
Awesome. And by the way, I meant to say, for those of you that haven't read it yet, this is really well written. It's well researched. It's very persuasive. Highly recommend. But my other question was, when I was reading your thesis, a sort of chicken and egg situation came up a lot, because you often mention studies, but then almost inevitably you mention something about more research is needed. But the problem is, can't get more research without less strict federal regulations, but we can't lessen the regulations without the research. So how do you see our country moving forward with that issue?
Well, right now, the most cannabis research comes from Canada, which legalized cannabis, I think, in 2018. And I think we can't really do anything to research it until it's legal, because even in legal states, it's federally illegal, so you can't get federal funding from it. Certain states don't want to fund it. The only way that we can properly research it if it's legalized. What Joe Biden wants to do is make it a Schedule II, so people can then research it more. Which it's for a justification, it seems fair, but it would not work. But on the surface level, it seems like it would. But if it was legal, more studies could be done into it without having to worry about the DEA busting in and taking all your specimens away from you.
Last question. This is just something I'm personally curious about. So if your research didn't go far into this, don't worry about it. But I don't remember you talking much about K2, which is synthetic marijuana that was really popular about a decade ago because it wouldn't show up on drug tests. But now it's actually still really common in the prison system. My husband works in federal corrections. He has a lot of inmates in for weed offenses, and then they in the halfway house, they resort to using K2 because they think it won't show up on drug tests, but inevitably it's much more, the effects are very negative. I'm just wondering, why do you think that it took so long for K2 to be made illegal? It was legal for a very long time. And also, do you think that people associate the bad effects of K2 with marijuana, and maybe that could contribute to some of the misconceptions about it?
I would assume so. I did not do much research into K2, but I do know that it is more dangerous than regular cannabis. But no, unfortunately, I did not research K2.
Just curious.
You good, Carrie? Done?
Yeah, sorry, I'm good. Thank you, Matthew. That's great.
Matthew, great job. I have to also say that your paper was very well written, and it was always a joy to read each quarter. You're a beautiful writer.
you.
So, I have 3 quick questions. One social, one sciencey, and one personal. So on the social side, you know, it seems as an observer, not very involved in this field, that the impetus for legalization has, you know, kind of been snowballing in recent years, state by state. So what do you think the driving force of that is? Is it just a generational shift in America? Is it increasing diversity, both ethnically, racially, et cetera? What do you think it is that is causing this now to start rolling on?
It's definitely, part of it is generational, but the part that I think is most important is that when states legalize, you see that it's not disastrous. Everyone thought that the Compassionate Use Act in California was going to be terrible and that a bunch of kids were going to start smoking and that California was just going to fall apart, but it didn't, and people genuinely benefit from it. People thought the same would happen in Colorado and Washington, but those policies ended up being really effective. And the points that they made to get those laws passed were important. In Colorado, Mason Tibbert, the founder of SAFER, or Safer Alternative for Enjoyable Recreation, focused on how so many of the things about weed that we focus on are bad and not necessarily true. And he focused on the fact that weed is undoubtedly safer than alcohol. And that was part of it. In Washington, Tonya Winchester, who started that movement, focused on how it was wasteful from a criminal justice perspective. And as those policies passed in their state, they grew outward, and now it's spreading around the nation, especially with the MORE Act, which focuses on how the war on drugs has adversely affected communities of color.
Gotcha. Now, a sciencey question. Let's say that even a small farm, you know, forget all the legal stuff, getting a license to grow it. What do you know about the plants as a whole? I mean, we hear a lot in agriculture about climate change impacting farmers' ability to grow their crops that they've traditionally grown, either due to droughts or just shifting climatic conditions. What do you know about the cannabis plant? Is it a viable option if I were a farmer and I'm having trouble growing my soybeans or whatever? If I wanted to go into growing cannabis as like a side crop, is it a hardy plant? Is it a delicate plant? Is it primarily grown only in like hydroponics indoors? What do you know about the production of it?
It's a very hardy plant, and it does well in hot and humid environments, and it does not do well indoors. Interestingly, so many companies are trying to build huge indoor grow facilities, but as legalization spreads, especially to the South, it's easier to grow it outside in the South than it would be to grow it in an indoor facility in Washington. So what a lot of people are worried about is that as legalization spreads, especially if it spreads to Central America, it's going to be so much easier to start small businesses and small farms there than to grow these huge multi-thousand, if not $1 million grow facilities inside.
And for the record, I'm happy teaching. I'm not looking for a side career. Third question. This is more personal. So did you find it difficult to kind of overcome your personal views on this issue as you started your research in order to present a, fair and balanced argument to both sides? Or did you find yourself keep getting swayed in your research towards how you went into this paper?
I tried my best to have an understanding of the side of people that want to keep cannabis illegal, but the more you do research into the effects of its prohibition, the reasons for its prohibition, have the benefits of it being legal, you can't really say that it should still be illegal. I tried to see the side, but it's like almost every argument you can make for cannabis prohibition, there is a significant counter argument that is better. Like, for example, people saying that legalization will increase teenage drug use. That's not necessarily the case. In Colorado, teenage drug use has steadily been going down since it's not as easy to get. Apart from the main customers being teenagers, I couldn't walk into a dispensary and buy anything. In Portugal, which decriminalized all drugs, drug use has been going down significantly. Whenever there are no regulations at all, it's a free-for-all. No one's going to check your ID if you're buying from a dude in the Papa John's parking lot. Like, they don't care. But dispensaries do. And I think that is how you combat teenage drug use.
Gotcha. Cool. Thank you.
I'm sorry if I got a little off topic there.
No, that's fine.
Just the lively audience here. Who wants to chime in here? Come on. Caitlin, go ahead. Oh, go ahead.
Okay. Sorry, go ahead, Caitlin.
Oh, no. Oh, okay. Well, I was going to go back to what Ms. South asked about with the K5. My brother works in the industry. He lives in Colorado. He when those synthetic kinds of drugs come out, they're able to policies can be put in place, and they can make certain strands by the chemical compound illegal. And so one of the things that made it very difficult to make things like K5 or the bath salts and those synthetic things that were in the news and are horrible for your body, those things are harder to regulate because they have to make all they have to do is chemically alter by just a little bit to make the law invalid for things. So that was one of the things that I wanted to kind of throw in. I really appreciate, and you don't know me, I'm Miss Johnston, Matthew, but I think it's really interesting that as much as we do know about cannabis, that the history of just the name and the connotation, that's something I did not know about, and I think that's fascinating. I wish that you had gotten to do some more interviews. There are actually a few former PA families who were trying to be on the dispensary list, and they, even with their financial.
My boyfriend has a dispensary.
Yeah, I was gonna let me in here.
So my boyfriend and his family have a dispensary, and he went through the whole process of getting the dispensary license. We're really good friends with the lab owner in Little Rock. Right now, he has a lawsuit where he is suing Harvest of Little Rock for using his name, which is Harvest Cannabis Dispensary in Conway. So the lawsuit, the reason why they're really trying, they officially have won, but the reason why they're so upset about this is because Robin's dispensary has always said that they were going to use Harvest as their name, and this dispensary, which are supposed to be majority Arkansas owner, is out of Arizona state, and they chose to use Harvest after applying with a different name on their dispensary license. So it's a lot of information out there. But yeah, Matthew, if you want to pick his brain about more of the legal side of things, he's got a lot of information. He's been contracted out by different states to help write licenses and help dispensaries and cultivators get licenses as well.
Awesome.
Cool.
Questions from the audience?
Matthew, I just want to say great job. We've talked about this project for years, since I mean, you've been interested in it for years, and you wrote your paper last year, and you've asked for books and sources and editing. And I mean, people might think this is a light topic, but you have taken it very seriously. So I just want to say, great job, Matthew. Like, I know lots of kids, lots of seniors laughed at the topic and why you chose it, but you treated it respectfully and academically. So I'll miss you. Congratulations, and come visit me when you're home. I mean, I'm in the library, but you handled this very well.
He did. Harper Chambers.
Good job. I just wanted to ask about if marijuana is legalized nationwide, should there be age restrictions on who can use it? Should it follow that of alcohol, or should we wait till 25 when the brain is fully developed and it's harder to alter that chemistry?
I think it should follow alcohol, because I think if alcohol should not be held to a different standard. It should not be, back to Portugal, they don't differentiate between hard drugs and soft drugs. It's just drugs. It's whether or not the relationship is unhealthy. So if we're going to hold cannabis to a higher standard than alcohol, that I don't think that that's necessarily fair. I think it should be 21. And if people don't like that, then we should also examine alcohol laws.
Any questions?
Matthew, I don't know if this is something that you looked into too much, but because of the best growing conditions, hot and humid outdoor conditions, I've heard that they require heavy doses of pesticide in order to grow marijuana. Have you looked into that, or some of the detrimental effects of pesticide use on the plant itself?
I have not, but I follow Normal on Instagram, and I see they post news articles, and there's a lot going on about how they're trying to change the restrictions on pesticides so they can have the pesticides that are better for the plant and for people. But because of the pandemic, that's kind of been tabled. But I know what you're talking about. I just don't know about it.
Itai mentioned during the interview when we were over there back in whenever that was, October, they talked about some devastation. They lost a ton of money, and it was a disaster. Some of the local growers, I know he had referenced that. Ms. Riggs, did you have something to chime in there? You look like you, no? Okay.
Oh, I have a question. Can you guys see me?
Sure, yes. Emily.
Hi, I'm Emily. I'm Matthew's older sister. Matthew, my question is, are there any industries that you think if they were, I guess, or are there any like companies or industries that if they had more strict like legal restrictions on them, say like private prisons or like junk food or soda, are there any industries you think that if they had restrictions placed on them, it would directly impact marijuana's legalization, or like over time it would affect how people view the drug?
Yes. I think that I'll focus on big pharma. I think that rather than pushing opioids, if doctors started working to stop saying like, okay, you had surgery on insert body part, instead of prescribing you oxys or hydrocodone, we're going to give you CBD oil. And if it works for you, you can keep it. If not, you can try and take the prescription opioids. I think that would help with not only boosting medical cannabis, but also changing the perception of it. Because now people, if you get surgery, they're going to be like, can I have painkillers? And it's going to be, no, we're going to give you this oil from a federally illegal plant. I think people are hesitant to do that. And I think if we start trying to push that rather than opioids, that would improve it.
So what policy that would be, I think, is the relationship between like big pharmaceutical companies and doctors themselves. So it's interesting to think about how policies and like lobbyists control how doctors provide patients care. So to think about policy towards legalization, you have to also think about all the other like things that are wrong but are legal in the big pharma world. So it's a good thought process.
I think Emily hit a great point there in the word lobbyist. they have so much influence on this issue, so much.
Yeah.
Big Pharma is one of the main reasons for the drug problem in the country, but they have entirely dodged the severity of the drug war. They are not touched by it.
So
which
that's
I
another
don't think it's fair
policy
that-
thing you could work on, or not you working on, but I agree that that is something that needs more focus legally.
Yeah.
Good job.
All right,
Proud
guys.
of you.
Thank you so much. Great job, Matthew. Let's give a round of applause, Matthew. Great.
Great job.
Thank you.
Is Harper still here? Where you at, Harper? Did he leave already?
No, I'm here.
I was going to tie your topic with you guys. If you stay for the conversation, I was going to tie his and Matthew. My niece, who I told you about, she's 45, she's autistic, and they've now got her medical marijuana for some of the issues she's having. But the biggest problem my brother's having is that insurance will not cover any of the cost. So they're having to pay 100% out of pocket, which it's working for her, but they just don't know how long they could sustain that, without insurance. While other drugs they want to fill her full of, that again, subsidized by Big Pharma, oh yeah, insurance will pay for those, but not for the medical marijuana. So
I would also like to add that I don't remember which state it was, but somewhere in the Northeast, a state that has legal cannabis medically, their federal funding for mental health has been cut because they allow legal cannabis to be used.
very draconian.
Yeah.
Ms. Gorman, are we ready to call it a day, Ms. Gorman?
Yeah, that was a great presentation. Congrats, Matthew. I'm very proud of you.
All right,
Thank
guys.
you.
I will see you tomorrow. Hopefully noon is Jacqueline Horsey. And then we have 3 more after that. So 2, 3, and 4 tomorrow. So thank you guys so much.
Congrats, Matthew.
Thanks for coming.